March 1944, a secondary rail junction near Krakow in the depths of occupied Poland. The night air carries the sharp bite of late winter cold mixed with coal smoke and machine oil. Platform 3 sits in near darkness, illuminated only by a single overhead lamp that casts long shadows across weathered concrete. The usual rhythm of the station, the clatter of coupling mechanisms, the hiss of steam brakes, the shouted coordinates of cargo handlers has gone silent. A freight train idles on the track, its engine rumbling low and steady. The locomotive bears no special markings, no identifying plaques, no destination boards, just a standard Deutsche Reichsbahn engine pulling 6 enclosed freight cars, their doors sealed with heavy iron bolts. No manifest sheets hang from the clipboard hooks on the side panels. No chalk marks indicate contents or routing codes. Even the coal tender appears deliberately understated, filled only partially, as if to avoid drawing attention through excessive smoke. Near the platform edge, a railway inspector stands with a leather-bound logbook pressed against his chest. His breath forms small clouds in the cold air. He is 43 years old, a career railwayman who began working these lines before the war, when trains carried grain, timber and textiles rather than the machinery of conquest and annihilation. His uniform is clean but worn at the cuffs. His hands, calloused from years of checking brake assemblies and coupling mechanisms, grip the logbook with a tension that has nothing to do with the cold. He watches as 2 SS officers confer near the locomotive, their voices low and deliberate. One checks a pocket watch, the other scans the platform with the casual vigilance of someone accustomed to operating in shadows. Behind them, partially obscured by the bulk of the freight cars, armed guards stand at irregular intervals along the train's length. They do not patrol, they simply stand, rifles held loosely, eyes forward. The inspector has seen trains like this before, not often, perhaps once every 3 or 4 weeks, but often enough to recognize the pattern. They arrive after midnight, they carry no standard paperwork, they depart before dawn, and they are never, ever logged in the official Reich transit records. From inside one of the sealed cars, a sound emerges, faint, muffled, almost swallowed by the engine's rumble. A cough, then another, then the soft shuffle of movement, bodies shifting on wooden floor planks. The inspector's jaw tightens. He knows what these sounds mean, he has known for months. The SS officer with the pocket watch glances toward the platform, notices the inspector standing there and makes a slight gesture with his hand. It is not a wave, it is not a greeting, it is a dismissal. The inspector understands immediately. He turns, walks back toward the station office, his boots echoing against the concrete. But as he reaches the doorway, he pauses. He turns his head slightly, just enough to see the train from the corner of his vision. The guards remain motionless. The officers have climbed aboard the locomotive. Within moments the train will depart, rolling southwest through the night, toward destinations that exist on no published timetable. The inspector enters the office and closes the door behind him. He opens the logbook to today's date. The page shows routine entries, a morning passenger service to Tarnow, an afternoon freight hauling machine parts to PR Zemmersel, an evening coal shipment bound for Arzesso. Platform 3's entry line remains blank. He sets down the logbook without writing anything. This moment, this choice to leave the page empty, will haunt him for the rest of his life. 23 months later, in a British interrogation facility outside Hamburg, this same railway inspector will sit across from 2 Allied intelligence officers and describe in meticulous detail the system of undocumented trains that moved thousands of women across occupied Europe. His testimony will expose a transportation network so carefully concealed that even the Reich's own railway administration had no complete record of its existence. He will speak for 11 hours over 3 days, filling page after page with routes, frequencies, patterns, and the terrible precision of a system designed to erase its own tracks. But on this cold March night in 1944, he simply closes the logbook and listens to the sound of the train pulling away into darkness. The story widens now. From this empty platform and this blank page in an inspector's log, the machinery becomes visible. By March 1944, the German war machine had reached a paradoxical state of simultaneous expansion and collapse. Geographically, Nazi control still extended from the Atlantic coast to deep inside the Soviet Union, from Norway's Arctic reaches to the Mediterranean. Yet beneath this vast territorial authority, the infrastructure of occupation was fragmented. Under the pressure of military reversals, partisan resistance, and the increasingly desperate measures taken to sustain both the war effort and the regime's ideological programs. Railway system, the Reichsbahn, formed the circulatory system of this occupation. More than 200,000 kilometers of track connected munitions factories to front lines, concentration camps to deportation centers, administrative headquarters to regional command posts. Every day, thousands of trains moved across this network carrying troops, weapons, supplies, prisoners, and the endless stream of materiel required to sustain a continental war. The system's efficiency was legendary. Schedules were coordinated with precision, manifests tracked cargo with bureaucratic thoroughness, inspectors verified loads, checked brake systems, confirmed paperwork, and logged every movement in station registries that fed into regional coordination centers. This was the official system, the documented network, the railway administration that historians would later study through captured archives, timetables, and freight records. But running parallel to this official network, sometimes literally on the same tracks, was another system entirely, a shadow railway, trains that moved without manifests, transports that appeared on no published schedule, freight cars carrying human cargo whose presence was deliberately omitted from all official documentation. The railway inspector who testified in 1945 had stumbled onto this system gradually, through accumulated observations rather than sudden revelation. He first noticed the pattern in late 1942, when trains began appearing at his station during night shifts with unusual characteristics. No advance notice from dispatch, no paperwork accompanying the engine crew, no destination codes chalked on the car panels, and most tellingly, no entry required in the station logbook. When he inquired about proper documentation procedures, a senior SS officer told him simply, "These transports are not your concern. Your logs remain as they are." The phrase was deliberate. Your logs remain as they are, not these trains are classified or documentation will follow. The instruction was explicit: create no record, leave the page blank, let the train pass through as if it had never existed. Over the following 18 months, the inspector documented every such train in a private notebook he kept hidden in his quarters. He recorded dates, approximate times, estimated number of cars, observed security details, and whatever information he could gather from locomotive crews willing to speak carefully in quiet corners of the station. What emerged was a pattern of systematic erasure. The trains appeared most frequently along secondary routes connecting major cities in occupied Poland, the Baltic states, occupied Soviet territories, and parts of Germany itself. They avoided main trunk lines where traffic control was most centralized and documentation most rigorous. Instead, they utilized regional branch lines, industrial spurs, and routes that passed through smaller stations, where oversight was less intensive and night shifts were often staffed by single inspectors or skeleton crews. The cargo was almost exclusively female prisoners, women captured in resistance operations, partisan sweeps or roundups following sabotage incidents, women accused often with minimal evidence of underground activity, intelligence gathering, courier work, or providing material support to resistance networks, women whose capture generated no public record, whose detention appeared in no prison register, and whose transportation across occupied territories left no administrative trail. The systematic nature of this concealment revealed itself in multiple layers. At the operational level, train crews received verbal orders rather than written dispatches. Locomotive engineers were told their destinations only after departure, receiving route instructions in stages at designated switching points. Guards accompanying the transports carried no standard SS documentation, but instead showed special authorization papers that inspectors were forbidden to examine closely or transcribe. Station personnel received instructions to disable platform lighting during these trains' passage, to clear nearby areas of unnecessary workers, and most importantly, to make no entries in official logbooks. At the administrative level, the concealment was even more sophisticated. The Reich Railway Administration maintained elaborate documentation systems tracking millions of individual train movements, from troop transports to munitions shipments to concentration camp deportations. These regular transports, including the systematized deportation of Jewish populations to death camps, were meticulously logged, often with chilling bureaucratic precision. Manifests listed numbers, origins, destinations, and cargo specifications. Regional coordination centers maintained oversight, supply requisitions, tracked the resources devoted to these operations. But the trains carrying accused resistance women existed outside this documentation entirely. They consumed railway resources, fuel, track time, rolling stock, personnel, yet generated no corresponding administrative records. This was not merely classification or restricted access to sensitive files. This was deliberate erasure at the point of creation. The records were never made in the first place. Why this particular form of concealment? Post-war investigations revealed multiple intersecting factors. First, many of these women had been captured through intelligence operations that regional SS and Gestapo commanders wanted to keep hidden from rival agencies or higher command structures. The fractious relationship between the Gestapo, the SD Sicherheitsdienst, the Abwehr military intelligence, and various SS branches meant that successful captures were sometimes concealed to prevent credit claiming by competing organizations or to hide the existence of valuable intelligence sources. Second, a significant number of these prisoners were subjected to interrogation procedures that violated even the Third Reich's own nominal regulations regarding prisoner treatment. While the Nazi regime committed countless atrocities under color of law, certain interrogation methods, particularly those involving prolonged psychological manipulation, environmental deprivation, and calculated humiliation, existed in a gray zone that made some officials nervous about documentary trails. By keeping these prisoners' movements unrecorded, interrogators maintained operational freedom while minimizing potential accountability. Third, the absence of documentation served a darker purpose. It made the women disappear twice, once physically when captured and removed from their communities, and once bureaucratically when their transportation and detention generated no official acknowledgement of their existence as prisoners. This second disappearance made it nearly impossible for families, resistance networks, or international observers to track their whereabouts or advocate for their treatment under international conventions regarding prisoners of war. The railway inspector's testimony exposed the operational mechanics of this system in granular detail. He described how guards would arrive at stations hours before the trains, clearing platforms and establishing perimeter controls. He explained how locomotive crews were rotated frequently to prevent any single engineer from developing comprehensive knowledge of the routes. He detailed the use of sealed freight cars rather than passenger carriages, ostensibly for security, but effectively isolating prisoners from any potential witnesses at stations or crossing points. He noted the complete absence of Red Cross inspections, medical personnel, or even the standard prisoner transport protocols that theoretically applied to captured resistance members under military jurisdiction. Most significantly, he provided specifics that Allied investigators could cross-reference with other evidence. He recalled conversations overheard between guards about destinations, references to the facility near Poznan or the center outside Königsberg. He remembered seeing on one occasion a manifest that had been carelessly left on a platform bench, which listed only a cryptic designation, Sonderbehandlung Category III Weiblich, Special Handling Category III Female. He described the physical state of women glimpsed during brief moments when car doors were opened for inspections. Exhausted, disheveled, some bearing visible injuries, all showing signs of prolonged stress and inadequate care. His account was corroborated by testimonies from other railway personnel, captured German officers, and most powerfully, by the women themselves. In the years following liberation, survivors from resistance networks across occupied Europe began describing their transportation experiences. Many remembered being moved repeatedly between facilities, traveling for hours or days in sealed freight cars, arriving at locations whose names they never learned because no identifying signs were visible and no information was provided. The absence of documentation that seemed so abstract when described by a railway inspector became viscerally real when survivors testified about vanishing into a system where no one could track them, where families received no information about their whereabouts, and where international humanitarian organizations could not intervene because officially these transports did not exist. The ghost trains were real. They consumed real fuel, ran on real tracks, and carried real women whose suffering was no less profound for being officially unacknowledged. But in the architecture of Nazi bureaucracy, a regime infamous for its obsessive documentation of atrocities, these particular transports were designed to leave no trace. The inspector's private notebook, recovered by British forces in 1945, contained entries spanning 19 months. He had documented 47 ghost trains passing through his station alone. Multiplied across dozens of similar junctions throughout occupied territories, the scale of this shadow network becomes apparent. But numbers alone cannot capture the full mechanism. To understand how this system functioned not merely as transportation, but as an instrument of systematic abuse, one must examine the specific methodologies embedded within these undocumented journeys. The methodology of the ghost train system operated on multiple dimensions simultaneously: logistical, psychological, and bureaucratic. Each dimension served to isolate prisoners, maximize vulnerability, and ensure systematic abuse could occur without accountability. The first and most fundamental mechanism was spatial disorientation through route manipulation. Unlike standard prisoner transports that followed direct routes between known facilities, ghost trains employed deliberately circuitous paths. The inspector's testimony described trains that would depart southbound from Krakow, travel for several hours, then reverse direction and proceed northwest. Others would stop at industrial sidings for hours or even days, before continuing to destinations that could have been reached far more efficiently via direct routes. This routing strategy served multiple purposes. It prevented prisoners from maintaining any geographical awareness of their location, making escape attempts nearly impossible and ensuring that if any information leaked about their whereabouts, it would be outdated and misleading. It also made the trains' movements harder to track for anyone attempting to monitor their passage. A transport that appeared at Station A heading south and later appeared at Station B to the north had clearly traveled a complex path, but reconstructing that path from fragmentary sightings was extremely difficult. The physical conditions within the freight cars constituted the second methodological dimension. These were not passenger carriages or even the standard prisoner transport cars used for concentration camp deportations. They were enclosed freight wagons, typically designed for cargo transport with minimal modifications for human occupancy. Ventilation came only through small barred openings near the roof. No seating was provided. Prisoners sat or lay on bare wooden floors. No sanitation facilities existed beyond a single bucket in the corner. No lighting penetrated the interior once doors were sealed, creating total darkness during night travel and dim, filtered half-light during the day. Temperature regulation was impossible. During winter months, the unheated cars became nearly frigid, forcing prisoners to huddle together for warmth against the bitter cold that seeped through the wooden walls. During summer, the enclosed metal-reinforced cars became suffocating heat traps, with temperatures inside reaching dangerous levels that caused dehydration, heat exhaustion, and in some documented cases, heat stroke. Food and water provision was deliberately inadequate and unpredictable. The inspector's testimony described observing guards loading trains with supplies that were clearly insufficient for the number of prisoners and the duration of planned transport. Some journeys lasting 3 or 4 days were provisioned as if for single-day travel. Water rations were particularly insufficient, creating severe dehydration that weakened prisoners physically and cognitively, making resistance or escape attempts less feasible, and making individuals more susceptible to psychological pressure during interrogations at their destinations. The temporal dimension formed another crucial element. Ghost trains operated on no fixed schedule. Departures occurred at irregular intervals, sometimes weekly, sometimes with gaps of several weeks, then suddenly multiple transports in quick succession. This unpredictability served operational security, making the pattern harder for resistance networks to detect and monitor. But it also created a psychological environment where prisoners had no framework for anticipating what came next, no ability to prepare mentally, and no sense of progress toward any end point. Journeys were prolonged far beyond logistical necessity. A trip that could be accomplished in 8 hours might stretch across 3 days through deliberate delays, extended stops at remote sidings, and circuitous routing. During these stops, prisoners remained locked in the cars, often with no communication from guards, no information about delays, and no indication of when movement would resume. Hours would pass in absolute silence and darkness, broken only by the occasional sound of guards outside or the distant noise of other trains passing on nearby tracks. This prolonged confinement created specific psychological effects, as survivors later described in testimony. The combination of darkness, silence, physical discomfort, and temporal disorientation induced a state of profound vulnerability. Prisoners lost track of time, sometimes unable to distinguish whether hours or days had passed. The sensory deprivation, no visual stimuli, minimal auditory input, unchanging tactile environment created cognitive strain. The inability to control even basic bodily functions with dignity, given the total absence of privacy and minimal sanitation, produced psychological distress that transcended physical discomfort. Social dynamics within the cars formed another dimension of the methodology. Unlike political deportations where prisoners often shared common backgrounds or ideological commitments that fostered solidarity, these transports deliberately mixed women from different resistance networks, different regions, sometimes different countries. Language barriers complicated communication. Suspicion was common. Prisoners feared informants had been inserted among them. The impossibility of private conversation in the confined, dark space meant that even attempts at solidarity building were constrained. Guards capitalized on this social fragmentation through selective information manipulation. At certain stops, doors would be opened briefly and a single prisoner would be removed, then returned minutes or hours later without explanation. The uncertainty created by these episodes, what happened to her, was she questioned, did she provide information, will I be next, intensified anxiety and suspicion. Sometimes guards would make brief statements before closing the doors again, offering fragments of information designed to unsettle rather than inform. "We're taking you to a facility where others from your network are already being held," or "Your coordinator gave us your name 3 days ago." The inspector testified that he had overheard guards discussing these techniques with a disturbing casualness. In one conversation he witnessed at a station platform, an SS officer explained to a younger guard that the transport itself was part of the softening process. By the time prisoners reached their destinations, he said, they would already be disoriented, exhausted, isolated, and psychologically primed for interrogation. The journey was not merely transportation, it was the opening phase of systematic psychological manipulation. Medical neglect constituted another deliberate element. No medical personnel accompanied these transports. No provisions were made for prisoners with pre-existing health conditions. Injuries sustained during capture received no treatment during transport. Women who became severely ill during the journey received no care beyond what other prisoners could provide, with no supplies, no medications, and no trained assistance. The inspector's private notes recorded at least 3 occasions when he observed bodies being removed from freight cars at his station, women who had died during transport and whose deaths would appear in no official records. The bureaucratic erasure methodology completed the system. Every dimension described above, the routing, the conditions, the duration, the psychological manipulation, occurred within a framework of deliberate non-documentation. When prisoners arrived at destinations, they entered facilities whose own records often provided minimal information about their origins, capture circumstances, or the charges against them. They had been transporting outside official channels, which meant their presence at these facilities existed in a bureaucratic grey zone that offered no protections and no accountability. The inspector noted one particularly chilling detail in his testimony. On several occasions, he observed manifest pouches being attached to locomotives pulling standard prisoner transports, the regular documented system for moving concentration camp inmates. These pouches contained paperwork that, while often containing false or minimal information, nevertheless acknowledged the prisoner's existence within Reich custody. Ghost trains carried no such pouches. They departed stations with no manifests to lose, no paperwork to be filed, no administrative acknowledgement to later be archived. This was not the mere classification of sensitive information. Classification implies documentation exists but access is restricted. This was systematic prevention of documentation at the point of creation, a methodology designed to make these transports invisible not just to external observers, but to much of the Reich bureaucracy itself. Survivors later testified about arriving at detention facilities where intake personnel seemed genuinely unsure what to do with them, lacking the normal paperwork that would indicate legal status, charges, sentencing, or processing protocol. Some women described being held in administrative limbo for weeks, neither formally processed as prisoners of war nor charged through military due systems nor entered into concentration camp registries. They existed in a bureaucratic void created by the ghost train system, present in physical reality but absent from official acknowledgement. The methodology then was comprehensive. It transformed transportation into a multidimensional system of abuse that operated simultaneously on logistical, physical, psychological, and bureaucratic levels. By the time women emerged from these trains, they had already endured an ordeal designed to maximize vulnerability, isolation, and susceptibility to further exploitation. And this system operated across hundreds of transports over multiple years, facilitated by countless individuals, railway personnel, guards, administrators, intelligence officers, most of whom never faced accountability because officially these trains never existed. The inspector's testimony exposed the mechanics, but to understand the human reality, one must examine a specific journey in detail. The transport that would become central to postwar investigations departed from a temporary holding facility outside Vilnius on the night of October 17, 1944. The date is significant. By this point in the war, Soviet forces were advancing rapidly through the Baltic states. German occupation authority was collapsing. Evacuations and retreats were constant. In this chaos, security operations intensified even as territorial control disintegrated. The facility outside Vilnius had been established 4 months earlier as Soviet forces approached the city. It was not a formal prison or concentration camp, but rather a requisitioned agricultural warehouse complex surrounded by hastily erected fencing and guard towers. Women detained during partisan sweeps in Lithuania, eastern Poland, and western Belarus were held here temporarily before being transported westward ahead of the Soviet advance. 23 women were loaded onto a train consisting of a single locomotive and 3 freight cars on that October night. Their ages ranged from 19 to 47. Their backgrounds varied: a schoolteacher accused of distributing underground newspapers, 2 sisters who operated a safe house for resistance members, a nurse suspected of treating wounded partisans, factory workers arrested after sabotage at their workplace, farm women captured during village sweeps following attacks on German patrols. Most had been held at the Vilnius facility for between 3 and 11 weeks. Several showed signs of previous interrogation, exhaustion, visible bruising, weight loss. The railway inspector who later testified was not present at the departure point, but his account becomes relevant because this particular train passed through his junction near Krakow 4 days later. What happened during those 4 days emerged through multiple testimonies. Survivors who lived through the journey, a railway worker at an intermediate station who witnessed a brief stop, and crucially, captured SS documents that survived the war through bureaucratic accident. The train departed Vilnius traveling southwest, theoretically heading toward transit facilities in occupied Poland, where prisoners would be redistributed to labor camps deeper inside German territory. This was the route explained to the locomotive crew, but the actual path the train followed over the next 4 days bore no resemblance to any direct route. The first anomaly occurred 8 hours into the journey when the train stopped at a rural siding north of Bialystok and remained stationary for 14 hours. No explanation was provided to prisoners. Guards occasionally opened the doors briefly but gave no information about the delay. Survivors later testified that this prolonged stop, coming so early in the transport, established immediate uncertainty and anxiety. They had expected a difficult journey, but had assumed it would follow some logical progression. This unexplained halt, in apparent wilderness with no visible facility or station, disrupted any mental framework for anticipating what came next. When the train resumed movement, it traveled south for several hours, then inexplicably reversed direction and proceeded northwest before eventually turning southwest again. This routing served no apparent logistical purpose. The distance covered in the first 30 hours could have been achieved in 6 hours via direct route, but the effect on prisoners was precisely what the methodology intended: complete geographical disorientation. Some women had tried to track direction using the sun's position visible through the small ventilation openings, but the reversals made this impossible. They lost any sense of where they were or where they were going. Temperature became a severe problem on the second night when unseasonably cold weather moved through the region. The temperature inside the unheated freight car dropped toward freezing. Women huddled together against the wooden wall, sharing what warmth they could generate collectively. One woman, the 47-year-old schoolteacher, was running a fever from an infection that had developed from untreated injuries sustained during her initial capture. Her condition deteriorated rapidly in the cold. Other prisoners tried to insulate her using their own clothing, but with no medical supplies and no possibility of summoning help, there was little they could do beyond trying to keep her warm and conscious. Water rations, inadequate from the start, were nearly exhausted by the 3rd day. The single bucket of water provided at departure had been contaminated within hours due to the unsanitary conditions and the number of people drawing from it. Dehydration symptoms appeared: severe thirst, dizziness, cognitive fogginess. One of the sisters who had operated the safe house later testified that by the 3rd day, several women were too disoriented to maintain coherent conversation. They sat silently, conserving energy, retreating into internal spaces where the physical hardship seemed slightly less immediate. The train made another prolonged stop at an industrial siding on the 3rd day. Through cracks in the wooden walls, prisoners could see they were at a factory complex of some kind: smokestacks, warehouse buildings, the silhouettes of other freight cars on adjacent tracks. They remained there for 19 hours. During this stop, guards opened the doors twice to distribute minimal food rations and to remove waste buckets, but no fresh water was provided. The schoolteacher's fever worsened. She drifted in and out of consciousness. Prisoners tried to keep her hydrated using the last remnants of water, but her body was failing. On the 4th night, the train finally approached the junction where the railway inspector later testified he witnessed its arrival. It was approximately 2:00 a.m. when the locomotive pulled onto platform 3. The inspector on duty for the overnight shift immediately recognized it as a ghost train. No advance notice, no manifest pouch, the distinctive security perimeter established by guards who had arrived hours earlier in a separate vehicle. He stood on the platform, logbook closed, and watched as officers conferred near the locomotive. The station was silent except for the engine's low rumble. At one point he heard sounds from inside the freight cars, not voices but the shuffling of movement, the sound of bodies shifting position. He noted the detail in his private journal later. The sounds from within the cars were notably subdued, less activity than typically observed in prisoner transports. Either fewer prisoners than the car capacity would suggest, or individuals too exhausted or incapacitated to move. The train remained at his station for approximately 40 minutes. During that time he observed one of the car doors being opened briefly. 2 guards entered. Minutes later they emerged carrying something between them. In the dim platform lighting, it took the inspector a moment to realize he was seeing a body. The woman, the schoolteacher, had died sometime in the previous hours. Her body was removed from the car and placed temporarily on the platform while officers discussed what to do with it. Eventually, it was loaded into a separate freight car that had been sitting empty on an adjacent track. No paperwork was prepared. No death was recorded. The body would be disposed of at some later point, at some unspecified location, with no official acknowledgement that she had ever been a prisoner in German custody. The inspector watched this occur from a distance of perhaps 20 meters. He made no intervention. He asked no questions. He filed no report. Later, this moment would weigh on him with crushing guilt, but in that moment he simply observed in silence as the train was cleared to depart and rolled away into the pre-dawn darkness, continuing its journey westward. The 22 surviving women remained sealed in the freight car, now traveling with the knowledge that one of their number had died and been removed like discarded cargo. The psychological impact of this was profound. It demonstrated with absolute clarity that their lives held no value to their captors, that death during transport would result in no accountability, and that no help would come regardless of circumstances. The train reached its final destination 36 hours after leaving the inspector's junction. The facility was a converted factory building outside Poznan that served as an interrogation and transit center for women detained in security operations throughout the eastern occupied territories. It was not a concentration camp in the systematic sense, nor a formal prison with established protocols. It existed in the same bureaucratic grey zone as the ghost trains themselves, a place that processed prisoners who officially weren't prisoners, whose presence generated minimal documentation, and whose treatment followed no standard regulations. The arrival process revealed the full integration of the transport methodology with the detention system. When the freight car doors finally opened after more than 5 days of travel, women emerged into harsh floodlighting that seared their dark-adapted eyes. Guards shouted commands in German, a language many prisoners did not speak. Disoriented, exhausted, dehydrated, and having just witnessed a death among their group, the women stumbled down from the freight car into a processing area where they were immediately separated, searched, and moved into the facility without any semblance of standard intake procedure. No names were recorded at this stage. No medical examinations were conducted despite obvious signs of severe dehydration and exhaustion. No information was provided about legal status, charges, or what would happen next. Women were simply moved into holding cells to await interrogation, their arrival acknowledged only in the most minimal internal facility records that made no reference to how they had arrived or from where they had come. One of the survivors, a factory worker who had been arrested after the sabotage incident, later testified about the first hours at this facility. She described being placed in a cold, concrete cell with 3 other women from the transport. They were given water, finally desperately needed water, but no food. They were told to remain silent. They waited for hours in exhaustion so profound that several women simply collapsed onto the concrete floor and fell into something resembling sleep, though their bodies were too traumatized by the journey to achieve true rest. The interrogations began the following day. The methodology documented in these sessions reflected sophisticated psychological understanding of how the transport experience had already undermined prisoners' resistance capacity. Interrogators did not immediately employ harsh physical tactics. Instead, they exploited the vulnerabilities created by 5 days in a freight car: disorientation, exhaustion, isolation, fear, and the demonstrated understanding that the women existed outside any protective framework of law or accountability. Questions focused on resistance network structures, names of contacts, locations of safe houses, and planned operations. Interrogators used information asymmetry strategically, making claims about what they already knew, showing documents allegedly seized from other resistance members, describing arrests that may or may not have actually occurred. The factory worker testified that her interrogator displayed detailed knowledge about the sabotage incident at her workplace, knew the names of several co-workers, and claimed that others had already provided testimony implicating her. Whether this information was accurate or fabricated remained unclear, but after the ordeal of transport and the shock of arrival, the psychological pressure was immense. The transport itself was referenced during interrogations. Guards made statements like "you survived the journey" or "others did not," or "we can always arrange for you to travel again." These references served as implicit threats. The possibility of being loaded onto another ghost train, enduring another multi-day ordeal under even worse conditions, became a tool of coercion. Some women provided information under these conditions, others did not. The factory worker testified that she gave her interrogators minimal details, confirming facts they clearly already knew while attempting to protect information that might endanger others still at large. Whether this partial cooperation represented a breaking of resistance or a strategic minimization of harm remained a question she wrestled with for years afterward. The moral complexity of resistance under systematic abuse was not something that could be easily categorized. Other women from the transport faced repeated interrogation sessions over days or weeks. Some were eventually transferred to labor camps, others were held at the facility for extended periods before being moved again via ghost train to other locations. The absence of documentation made tracking their subsequent fates extremely difficult. Even years after liberation, families searching for missing relatives struggled to determine what had happened to women who had vanished into this system. The death of the schoolteacher during transport remained unacknowledged. No official record of her death exists in any discovered German archives. Her name appears on no transport list, no facility roster, no death registry. Postwar investigators attempted to determine her identity through survivor testimony, but the women who had traveled with her knew her only by first name and could provide limited identifying information. She remains, in official historical record, a ghost among ghosts, one life among thousands extinguished within a system designed to leave no trace. The train that had carried her and 22 other women from Vilnius to Poznan was cleaned, returned to service, and used for another ghost transport 3 weeks later. The locomotive crew received new verbal orders, guards assembled at another station, the machinery continued its work. And at his junction near Krakow, the railway inspector opened his logbook, found the page recording that night in October, and left the entry line for Platform 3 blank, as he had been instructed, as the system required, as the methodology demanded. No train, no passengers, no death, no record, just an empty line in an official log representing what the Third Reich wanted the world to believe. Nothing happened here. But the inspector's private notebook told a different story, and that story, recovered by chance by British forces in 1945, would eventually help expose a system that its creators believed would remain hidden forever. The railway inspector's testimony began on July 3, 1945, at a British interrogation facility outside Hamburg. He had been detained not as a suspected war criminal, but as a railway official whose cooperation was sought in reconstructing German transportation networks. During routine questioning about railway operations, he mentioned in passing that he possessed a personal notebook documenting irregular transports during the occupation. When interrogators examined the notebook, they immediately recognized its significance. Over 3 days of recorded testimony, the inspector described every ghost train he had witnessed passing through his station. He provided dates, times, approximate numbers of prisoners, observed security measures, overheard conversations, and most importantly, the systematic pattern of non-documentation. His testimony was precise, methodical, and delivered in the same careful manner that had characterized his professional work as a railway inspector. He showed no pride in providing this information, only a quiet insistence that it be recorded accurately. British intelligence officers initially struggled to contextualize his account. They had extensive documentation of concentration camp transports, military troop movements, and the massive railway logistics supporting the Holocaust. But these undocumented ghost trains represented something they had not yet fully mapped, a parallel system operating beneath the level of official Reich bureaucracy, designed specifically to evade the documentation that would later become evidence. The inspector's testimony took on greater significance when it was cross-referenced with other evidence emerging from occupied territories. Soviet forces advancing through Poland and the Baltic states discovered detention facilities that contained prisoners whose presence in the Nazi custody system could not be traced through captured documents. Women held at these locations described transportation experiences that matched the inspector's observations: prolonged journeys in sealed freight cars, circuitous routes, complete absence of paperwork, and the pattern of systematic erasure. As more survivors were liberated and began providing testimony to Allied authorities, Red Cross officials, and nascent war crimes investigation units, a clearer picture emerged. The ghost train system had operated across a vast geographical area, from France through occupied Poland and into the Baltic states and occupied Soviet territory. Women captured in resistance operations, partisan sweeps, or security crackdowns were moved through this shadow network to interrogation centers, temporary detention facilities, and smaller camps that existed outside the major concentration camp system that received most historical attention. The scale was substantial. While precise numbers remain impossible to determine due to the deliberate lack of documentation, estimates based on survivor testimony, witness accounts, and fragmentary records suggest thousands of women were transporting via ghost trains during the war years. Some transports carried as few as 15 or 20 prisoners. Others involved multiple freight cars with 50 or more women. The frequency varied by region and time period, intensifying during 1943 and 1944 as resistance activity increased and German security operations became more aggressive in response. The fate of many women who traveled these routes remains unknown. Some survived their interrogations and detentions, eventually being transferred into the documented concentration camp system or released under various circumstances as German authority collapsed. Others died during transport, as the schoolteacher had, or perished at the facilities where they were held. Many simply vanished, last seen being loaded onto freight cars at one location, never definitively traced to any specific destination, their fates lost in the bureaucratic void created by the system designed to erase them. The inspector provided one piece of testimony that particularly disturbed Allied investigators. He recounted a conversation he had overheard in early 1945, just weeks before Soviet forces reached his area. Two SS officers were discussing the evacuation of detention facilities ahead of the Soviet advance. One officer stated explicitly that prisoners whose detention had been irregularly documented should be handled accordingly. The inspector understood this as a euphemism for execution. When Soviet forces later discovered mass graves near several facilities in occupied Poland, it became clear that many women who had survived interrogations and imprisonment were killed as German forces retreated, eliminating witnesses whose testimonies might later expose the ghost train system and the abuse that had occurred within it. The British forwarded the inspector's testimony to the International Military Tribunal preparing for the Nuremberg trials. However, his account did not feature prominently in the main proceedings. The tribunal focused on systematic crimes with clear documentation and high-level command responsibility: the Holocaust, aggressive warfare, major concentration camps, medical experiments. The ghost train system, while clearly criminal, was harder to prosecute because it involved lower and mid-level officials, lacked documentation by design, and cut across multiple jurisdictions and agencies. Several regional tribunals and national war crimes proceedings did address aspects of the ghost train system. Soviet authorities prosecuted some Gestapo and SS officers who had operated detention facilities in occupied territories, and transportation-related crimes featured in several cases. French authorities investigated interrogation centers on French soil where women had been held after ghost train transports. Polish prosecutors examined facilities in occupied Poland. But the fragmentary nature of evidence and the diffusion of responsibility across many individuals and agencies made comprehensive prosecution difficult. Railway inspector himself was never charged with any crime. British authorities concluded that while he had been complicit through his silence and his willingness to leave logbook entries blank, he had not actively participated in abuses and had ultimately preserved evidence through his private documentation. He was released in late 1945 and returned to railway work in postwar Germany, though he reportedly struggled with guilt about his wartime inaction for the remainder of his life. His testimony and his private notebook were deposited in Allied archives, where they remained largely obscure for decades. Historians focused on more visible aspects of Nazi crimes, the major concentration camps, the Holocaust's systematic nature, high-profile war criminals. The ghost train system received limited attention in early post-war histories, mentioned primarily in studies focused specifically on resistance movements or women's experiences during occupation. This began to change in the 1970s and 1980s as Holocaust and war crimes scholarship broadened to examine aspects of Nazi criminality that had received less initial attention. Researchers studying resistance networks encountered repeated references in survivor testimony to transportation experiences that matched no documented train movements. Scholars examining women's experiences during the war found patterns of detention and interrogation that existed outside standard procedures. The railway inspector's testimony, rediscovered in British archives, provided a crucial framework for understanding these fragmentary accounts. By the 1990s, enough evidence had been compiled to establish that the ghost train system represented a systematic methodology rather than isolated incidents. Academic studies documented the operational patterns, the geographical scope, the integration with interrogation procedures, and the deliberate erasure of documentation. The United Nations referenced this research when expanding definitions of crimes against humanity to encompass psychological torture and systematic documentation destruction designed to prevent accountability. Survivors who lived long enough to see this research emerge often expressed conflicted feelings. Some felt vindicated that their experiences were finally being acknowledged and understood as part of a systematic operation rather than isolated abuses. Others found the academic attention inadequate compared to the minimal criminal prosecution that had occurred. Many simply wanted their suffering acknowledged, their losses recognized, and the truth preserved so that the machinery of erasure did not succeed posthumously. The schoolteacher who died during the October 1944 transport was never definitively identified. Despite efforts by researchers and genealogists working with survivor testimony, no name could be confidently attached to the woman who perished in that freight car. She remains anonymous, a symbol of the countless individuals whose identities were erased along with the records of their imprisonment and death. The ghost train system ultimately failed in its objective of complete concealment, but it succeeded in fragmenting the evidence so thoroughly that comprehensive historical reconstruction remains incomplete. We know the system existed. We know thousands of women suffered within it. We know it operated through deliberate erasure of documentation. But we cannot name all the victims, cannot map all the routes, cannot identify all the perpetrators, and cannot fully calculate the human cost. The railway inspector's testimony stands as one of the most detailed windows into this machinery. His decision to keep a private notebook, an act of considerable personal risk, preserved evidence that would have otherwise vanished completely. His testimony helped establish that what survivors described was not isolated abuse by rogue officers, but systematic methodology embedded in transportation networks that spanned occupied Europe. In his final session with British interrogators, the inspector was asked why he had kept the notebook, knowing the danger it posed if discovered. He reportedly paused for a long moment before answering. "I suppose," he said, "I wanted someone to know, even if I never spoke of it, even if it never came to light, I wanted there to be some record that these trains existed, that these women were real, that what was done to them happened." That record exists now, not complete, not comprehensive, but enough to ensure that the ghost trains designed to leave no trace are remembered, enough to honor the women who suffered within a system engineered to erase their very existence, enough to remind us that some of history's darkest machinery operates not through spectacular violence but through bureaucratic erasure, through blank lines in logbooks, through absent manifests, through the quiet choice to create no record and thus no accountability. The trains have long since been scrapped, the tracks reconfigured, the stations rebuilt, but the testimony remains. The private notebook survives in archives, the survivors' voices echo across decades, and the truth, incomplete but undeniable, resists the erasure that its perpetrators intended. History often concentrates on the loudest moments, battles, invasions, liberation, and tribunals, but some of its darkest truths traveled silently through the night, sealed in freight cars that officially never existed, carrying women whose names never appeared in any registry, moving through a network designed to leave no evidence of its own operation. The railway inspector's testimony ensures that this silence is broken, that the blank lines in the logbooks are read not as absence but as deliberate concealment, that the ghost trains, invisible to official records, become visible to historical memory, and that the women who suffered within this system, those who survived and those who did not, those whose names we know and those who remain anonymous, are acknowledged, honored, and remembered not as ghosts but as real human beings whose experiences demand recognition, whose suffering demands accountability, and whose stories demand that we never forget the machinery designed to erase them.